Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you've participated in previous career month speaker series, some of them are in webinar format, some of them are in more traditional like meeting format. This is one of the meeting formats. So it means that I see you, you see me, my video and my presentation, and there's also an opportunity for the exchange, for interaction. At the end of the session, we'll have a question and answer section. So if you have any questions, please reserve them till the end of the presentation. When I heard about this series and the proposal that communications department put together about the series of communications related career calls, related advices and tips and tricks, I immediately thought about visual communication. First, because it's my field, I'm a visual communications expert. And second, because it's an emerging and very prospective area in professional communication in general. Professional communication content these days is, I would say, mostly visual, just because of the simple fact that communication mostly have moved to different platforms, platforms that are not primarily text-based. So today's focus, the focus of today's lecture is on application of visual communication in the workplace. We'll talk a little bit about the current trends and prospective developments. So when I was starting to look at visual thinking and learning, it was back in the days in the late 1990s when visuals was kind of on the background of communication, any type of communication. What was on the foreground was text, right? Everybody was using text to communicate. And that was, again, primary focus. And there were reasons for that, because the technology was just not there at the moment. And let's step back and take a look at what the evolution of the professional communication looks like in general, right? And we'll look at it in the context of visual communication and its importance for the workplace application. First, we'll talk mostly about the importance of visual communication in general for our species. And then we'll try to find specific applications that are typical for professional communication. So why is visual communication important? If you think about it, and this is the way I pretty much like to start all of my lectures, all of my presentations about visual communication, going back and looking at the history of communication in general. Right? When you think about it, our primary channel of medium of communication for a long time has been primarily text. But text is not that old, right? We've been using text for a relatively short amount of time throughout the history of human civilization. Our oldest alphabet is like maybe 4,000 years old. This is one of the earliest examples of alphabet. But the history of our civilization is way longer, right? You go back and look at some of the earliest human remains. They date back 160 years old, 170, up to 200,000 years old. But let's say this line is the timeline. So going back 200,000 years old. And this is where we are now at this moment, right? And for the entire, compared to entire duration of this timeline, we've only had writing as the channel of communication for this short period of time, for this short fragment of that entire timeline. So what did we have before that? Before that, we had visuals. And there's a science now to back that, to actually justify our primary focus on visual communication these days. Here's some numbers, right? 50% of our brain is involved in visual processing. So 50% of the entire brain, it's involved in information reception, decoding, processing, right? And 70% of all of the receptors, we have 5 senses, right? So, and our eyesight is only one of them, but 70% of our receptors in our entire body are in our eyes, sensory receptors in our eyes. And 90% of information that enters the brain is nonverbal, which means that we don't read it, or we don't hear it. It's mostly comes through the visual perception. Here's another interesting number. 1/10 of a second. That's the time that it takes us to make sense of the new visual environment, to understand the new visual environment. Let's say I'm in an unfamiliar place and there's some kind of sound on the background. I turn my head like this. It takes me, when I turn my head suddenly, it takes me 1/10 of a second to understand the visual content, what I'm seeing at that point. And that is 60,000 times faster than reading the text. So it tells us something about the importance of visual communication for us as biological beings, right? Which leads us to a very specific thing. For a long time, when we had text as our primary medium of information exchange and delivery, we used to read the entire text, everything that's put in front of us. I remember how I used to read the newspapers. And even though I'm a career journalist, my information consumption habits have changed as well. So I would pick up the newspaper and I would read everything, right? Because that was all of the information that was available to me. And that was true for the majority of information consumption. Today, because we have an option to opt out and use visuals instead, at least as a partial replacement of the text, we now have a very specific habit, and comes from some of the research done in the mid-2000s. Today's audience will only read 20% of the text put in front of them when the text is longer than 600 words, right? Does it mean we just stopped reading books? No, we still read books. What it means is that we have become a headline-driven culture. What it means? It means that when the longer pieces of information are broken up by some form of visual, whether it's an image or a headline or some visual element, a line, a bullet point, then we are more likely to pay more attention and invest more time into that information, digging deeper into that specific information. That has created another effect over time. And that effect was discovered in the early 2010s, but the studies in that direction have been happening since 2000s after the internet, widespread implementation of internet technologies in communication. And I will tell you the name of that in a minute, but here's a description of the effect. There was a study, there were serious studies, but the first one did this. People were presented with the same information in different formats. The first group was presented with information in text-only format. And after 72 hours, only 10% of the respondents, of participants, can recall more than 50% of that information for text-only format. The second group was presented with image-only format. And 35% of the respondents were able to actually identify and describe more than 50% of the content. Better, right? But the third group was presented with the combination of text and images, text and visuals. And staggering 65% of respondents recalled 50% or more of that information 72 hours later. Why is 72-hour important number? Studies show that if you can remember information after 72 hours after the exposure to the information, that information has moved from your short-term memory, which is 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, depends on, it's a field specific, information specific. But after 72 hours, it has moved to your long-term memory, and that's gonna stay with you for a long time. So that effect was named picture superiority effect, that the combination of images and text stays with us the longest and easiest to process and to remember. And we already use the PCE in our daily life. Oh, there's a typo there. So we already apply it to different things that we do. We already apply it to social media, right? So 75 to 85% of all of the content in social media now these days is digital, is visual, right? Digital visual. We apply it to the books. Most of the books, pick them up. You know, even if you compare the same book, you compare the most recent editions of the same book to its earlier editions, you can see that you will have more visual content. And that's based basically on this, because the publishing houses they have an interest, they have the horse in the race, and they are more interested in retaining the readership, making sure that people actually read through the books. So they apply all of these new trends and technologies to their work. We use it in press, of course. It was surprising for many when in the early to mid 2000s, one of the most popular news sites was BuzzFeed. Think about it, BuzzFeed and news site. For a simple reason, they discovered if they break up their text with some form of visuals after every 100, 200 words, they get more readership, they get more shares, more likes, more interaction, more comments, right? And that principle was picked up. That was a success story. That principle was picked up by many in the media industry, in journalism, and you can see it throughout in any form of journalistic communication these days. And that effect also found its way into our interpersonal communication. Think about it. When you even text someone, you're likely to use a form of visual, and we don't know what that is, right? That's the emojis. What is that? That is the pictographic expression of our emotions, of the feelings. A picture worth 1,000 words, right? Sometimes an emoji saves you some words, and helps you to express things that you would normally express face-to-face in an interpersonal communication. So we have visual means now to actually replace the face-to-face interaction to some degree. Okay, so we know it works, right? But the concept of visual communication, based on the previously described models and concepts and understanding of psychology and physiology of visual perception, the concept of visual communication in that context is very simple. We're trying to make information as easy to digest as possible. So one of the first things we're teaching communications is how to make information consumption, our experience, our readers, effortless as possible. And visuals have proven to be one of those ways, right? And it serves different purposes. So some of the things that we actually really try to do in communication in general. So it helps us advance our efforts and be more effective in doing these things. So visual perception in general affects audience's ability to understand. So again, it makes the information consumption process more effective, which leads to your image as a professional, right? If it's easy for me to understand what you're saying, the message that you're trying to get across, it increases it betters your image as a professional, your professional credibility. And that's one of the things that is very important in any form of communication, especially in professional communication, when you very often represent not just yourself, but also your organization, your brand, everything, or the ideas that you're trying to push through the agenda. Okay, and it's also important because this is also based on some studies. 95% of today's audiences prefer visual content. Why? For the reasons described a minute ago, right? Because that is more natural to us. Text was good until we had an alternative in forms of visual. So as soon as we got a chance to jump back to visual thing, back to visual content that is more natural, more organic for us to use, we immediately took that opportunity, and we're taking advantage of that opportunity ever since. And we're never going back, because this is more efficient, this is more natural, And 94% of modern audience, first impression about your brand, about your company, about your product or service is based entirely on the design, the appearance of your visual content, your visual design, the visuals that represent your organization. So imagine if you first learn about FedEx from this image, from this poster, right? Or if you learn first about the safari tour from this image, right? What kind of emotional response does it trigger? Probably something silly, it's funny, it's entertaining, and that adds up to your perception of the image of the organization because you remember emotions, right? Those are always the things that we remember the best and they stay with us the longest, things that can trigger emotional responses in us. And visuals are great in triggering those kinds of emotional responses. How about this? Wildlife protection organization, right? It's interesting. The first thing you see is the very attractive visual that grabs your attention, right? And then with that emotional context, you look at the organization's logo, you look at other things, the information that comes along with it. But you're already looking at all that other additional information through the prism of this very attractive visual, through the prism of emotions that you felt when you first saw this image. And a lot of organizations are shifting to visuals for that sole purpose, because it's more attractive, because it creates a certain image. One of the courses that we teach in communications is professional report writing, right? What I'm observing recently in the last few years, let's say, is that the format of reports in many organizations is shifting from digital text. Let's say not a lot of people are printing out reports these days, it's digital distribution, but it's shifting even from digital text to digital visuals in the form of infographics. This is a corporate report, for example, real life corporate report. And it includes very little text, but it includes a lot of visuals to illustrate the numbers, the information, the trends. And that is the trend that we see increasingly in professional communication in general. And that is probably something that you will be expected to do in your professional career if you are somehow involved in communications. But keep in mind that communication these days is a very wide umbrella that includes a lot of things. Pretty much 50% of everything that you do in a workplace can be described as a form of communication, one way or another. So chances are you are likely to do something with the visual content related in your career, whether or not you have any interest in it. That's the unfortunate reality if you haven't really studied communication this way. But it's not hard to do. And that trend is also proven by some of the researchers. There was a study maybe a few years ago, I would say 3 or 4 years ago, I don't remember the exact date. But the study, this was a survey of the company mid-level and high-level management, CEOs and slightly lower level in the hierarchy. And it showed that 74% of them used visual assets in their marketing strategies. So this particular survey was focused on marketing efforts and what kind of visuals, what kind of content they'd be using. And 74% used visual assets. Gets even more interesting. 61% of them said that visual content was absolutely necessary for the product that they're developing. Another 32%, almost 32% said it's very, very important. So over 90% of respondents, the company managers, corporate managers said that it's basically a pure necessity to have visual content in any marketing material, any marketing product that they're putting out for the public. When it came to their expectations from the college graduates for entry-level positions, 37% said that the graduates, the people who enter the entry-level positions have to be able to be engaged in visuals consistently, right? So these numbers are all across the internet. You know, you can find several studies in the recent years. People have been started looking at from different disciplines, from different perspectives. But overall, the general concept is that visuals are essential parts of communication these days. And again, communication, you know, most of what you do in a workplace can be considered communication, internally or externally, right? All of this. So let's say we tentatively establish that visual communication is important for a workplace, right? How do we address that? We have trained our audience, not we, well, the society, the technology have trained our audience to demand visual content because of the information consumption habits, the changed technological advancements, and the nature of the formats that were of this information that are happening across different fields and disciplines. So visual information is how we're all connecting on a human level these days. Our natural human level communication is transferred into our communication in general, and it's transferred gradually and carefully into professional communication. Okay, how do we address that? I realize that, you know, even within this group, I'm sure there are people who don't have any specialization in communication, even though, as I said, most of the work that you will do in the workplace is likely to be qualified as communication. But how do we address, you know, dealing with traditional communication methods and approaches is challenging enough if you don't have a specific training. But how do we, on top of that, engage with the visual content creation? And it's widespread. Today's marketers are developing 14 to 12 different types of visual content for a single, let's say, advertising or marketing campaign. It's not the same person who does all 14 types, obviously. Some of them are all outsourced. But the bottom line is that you need to be able to create at least some form of visual content. Does it mean that you have to be a professional trained, let's say, graphic designer, videographer, photographer? You don't have to be. And that's the principle that we're trying to teach, especially in the lower level visual communication courses in communications programs in Canada and across in the US. I would say it's also a trend, is that you need to have a very basic understanding of visual principles. And especially the ones that are universal, like the classical elements of visual communication, visuals in general, the principles of design, principles of composition, visual strategies to approach the content creation. When you have that understanding, you get two things. You get an understanding of how to address a specific problem, which particular format would be the best to address that problem, and also how to evaluate the visual content that is in front of you from those specific standpoints. Do we have a clear composition here? Do we have an effective message delivery here? So just the understanding of basic concept is good enough to start working or interacting with visual content in professional environment. Okay, we're not going to get very deep into like very specific things about that because we only have limited time. We're not going to talk about, like, for example, which specific type of infographic is good for any specific type of data set, right? Or other things like what kind of photography or cameras you're supposed to use, what kind of photograph strategies, or what kind of sequence of videos you're supposed to use. All of those you can learn in specialized courses, in visual communication courses, in other visual courses across different programs. What we're going to talk a little bit about today is visual trends and perspectives, right? Things that are happening, either happening now or are likely to happen in the near future in the field of visual communication, or both. Maybe they are ongoing, and most of these items that we'll talk about are that way. They're ongoing, and there's also great potential for further development. The first of them is extended reality. And I'm sure you've heard about the Facebook meta, whatever they call it, which is basically virtual reality, right? I am personally not a big fan of that because I think it will contribute even further to the self-isolation and the lack of the humanly interaction between individuals. But we cannot avoid the reality that it has a great potential for the professional communication, for development of professional communication, and for the efficiency of professional communication. And this is one of the areas that we actually really need to look into and evaluate its potential for professional world, which transfers into potential for teaching in the communications programs. So there are different types of that. Like extended reality is a wide term. It includes virtual reality, augmented reality, or mixed reality. For example, when you're using real-time environment, but you're putting virtual objects on top of it. And technologically, it's getting more and more sophisticated year by year. Like the modern Oculus devices and some other virtual reality devices, they have motion sensors. They have built-in radars, which can see what is going on in real life in the environment, which can trace your motions and the motions of the person on the other side and create some kind of interactive, real-life interactive environment. Its potential is great, especially in the areas of training, remote training and remote presentations. I just read an article recently about its potential use for teaching, remote teaching, right? Imagine the entire class having Oculus devices and using them to be virtually present in a virtual classroom and teaching, lecturing in that virtual classroom, which would include potentially in the future, technology is not quite there yet, also real life interaction within the virtual reality, which gets us very close to actual real life experience, classroom experience, right? So extended reality is one of the areas where we see developments. It will require a certain approach to communication, the way we present information, because virtual reality will have its own requirements and features. One of them, off the top of my head, is its 3D, three-dimensional, multidimensional nature, right? You're not just looking at the two-dimensional environment now. You have to be able to evaluate its potential for three-dimensional, 3D presentation. So that is coming. The second one is artificial intelligence. And I know it's scary. It scares me too, especially after listening to Elon Musk recently and his predictions about artificial intelligence and how dangerous it is for humankind. But nevertheless, it's getting more important and more interesting what we can actually do with artificial intelligence. Machines, the one thing that is crucially important for artificial intelligence is the ability to learn from people. It ends up in a form of code. Its base algorithms end up in a form of code. But in order to create that code, artificial intelligence needs to observe. One of the things that it observes is the visual representation of the world around it. What's happening? We already see examples of that in face recognition software and hardware that is being used around the world. Sometimes it's used just like any technology. It can be used for good and for evil. And we see it used for evil pretty commonly these days when the face recognition technologies are being used by different governments to actually spy after the people and identify the mood in the crowd among the people and address it in a certain way, whether immediately or with long-term strategies. So artificial intelligence observes the visuals, including the expression on your face, and then it translates it into a code and it applies that code to its algorithm, the way it's supposed to interact with the world and with others. But artificial intelligence is not limited to machine to human interaction. It also does this, machine to machine interaction. And the machine learning is very important in this thing, because once one piece of artificial intelligence, one unit learns something, it shares that knowledge with everything else that's included in its network, which means that the information learned by one device will be shared with others and will become common knowledge in a centralized knowledge for all of the machines, all of the different intelligences to use and learn from. So the knowledge is cumulative in that sense. The knowledge has, it adds up, and one piece of knowledge builds on top of another. And at the end, it exceeds the capacity of a human brain, and exceeds even the desires of any single human being to learn and develop. It ends up, we already have some real life practical applications of that. And you probably know this logo. This is Siri. So all of those virtual assistants have learned from in that way. They were exposed to real life situations, to real life interactions between people, and they've learned from that, and they developed their own behavioral algorithms. The next step for them, and there already talks about that, is to have some kind of visual representation of these virtual assistants, right? Google is experimenting with this Google Assistant with the holographic devices. So you can have a small holographic person of your choice, or whatever it may be a cat that talks to you. But the visual representation of the artificial intelligence, we don't know where it's going to go, right? It's kind of unpredictable, but we know that visual learning is a big part of it, which means that we need to address that from visual communication standpoint, at least in a way that we feed the AI the information, which form we feed the AI that information. The third one is inclusive optical perception. And optical perception has been treated, it's a wide known phenomenon, and the trend and the general direction in graphic design. In most of the cases, prior to this most recent trends, we used optical perception to kind of create these neat effects. Most of you probably know about the FedEx logo and the hidden arrow in that logo, right? That's the creative use of negative space, the creative use of optical perception, just the way we perceive it. And it's not unique to FedEx. A lot of logo design is based on that effect. A lot of other approaches, in general design across different fields of design using optical perception. But now we have another layer to that. And that is the responsibility of the field of communication, visual communication, to be able to, for like all of the people, including the ones with certain limitation, to increase the efficiency, accessibility, along with the efficiency of the developed message. We try to do that in our classrooms to some degree. How do we address the needs of people with, let's say, color blindness, or with low vision, or people on the autistic spectrum, or people who have dyslexia? Because for each of these particular groups, and once we started paying more attention and being more inclusive, we have recognized that there are a lot more people with these kinds of limitations around us that we realized before. So it's becoming increasingly important to address the needs of them. And there are different instructions and guidelines on the web. This one, for example, is the accessibility guidelines from Americans with Disabilities Acts organization. And it gives you very simple guidelines. Like, for example, in order to address the needs of the people with low vision, make sure there's a contrast in your visual elements, or that you don't use, let's say, colors as the only symbol that represents certain message, certain function, right? If red is supposed to mean danger on this website, or on this website, or in this visual content, or in the video, that shouldn't be the only thing that says danger. There's supposed to be options to explain the same message, deliver the same message in other forms, maybe in the form of text or other symbol that has nothing to do with the color. And there are many things that you can do depending on your target audience and what kind of groups you're addressing. But these are the most recent trends and the valuable ones to keep in mind from accessibility standpoint. The fourth trend is shift to vertical, and you can probably guess what it's based on, why we're doing this. For a very long time, okay, so the nature of our own vision is horizontal, right? Why? Because including our peripheral vision, we kind of always see the world as a panoramic image. And for a long time, when we tried to create artificial, non-verbal ways of communication, we transferred that understanding, that vision into our forms of communication. So most book pages are vertical, right? But our reading experience in most of the cases is horizontal, right? So, and even when you look at the history of book printing, the way the images and visuals have been used, in most of the cases, the visuals are used in a horizontal format because I would say unintentionally, because that's the more natural for human beings. That's the way we like to treat the images, all of the images. Later in the communication stages with digital communication, even in the text, we tend to design our vertical pages horizontally within the boundaries of the general vertical format. That's one of the reasons why most of the alphabets, there's only a horizontal writing, right to left or left to right, side to side. Anyways, there's probably a handful of different languages that actually use vertical writing style, not many. So, but that changed slightly in the new reality, in the most recent trends, and you can guess what caused it. The small screens. The small screen paradigm tells us that we tend to switch our storytelling, flow of information and storytelling to the vertical format, right? Because typically the way we interact with the information on the small screen, we scroll through it. And the flow of information in the visual storytelling, just because of that reason, because of the nature of the vertical screen, has shifted from horizontal to vertical. This is probably what you're going to see in most of the cases when you scroll through any material. Number 5 is close-ups, more specifically product close-ups. It helps us focus on details, on cut into the larger context. And where do we see that more often? In like professional communication, let's more specifically in sales. When we have a product, right? And when you move your cursor over that product description, product image, you typically see this, a more detailed image, which helps you better understand the context, will even get the kind of the tactile feeling of what it would feel like, what the material would feel like, the texture of it, even the appearance, to better understand, to get as close to real life experience as possible, right? It's not exclusive to this product sales perspective, but this is the most commonly used approach to close-ups, because close-ups used to be really the art thing, right? It was a way for visual artists in any format to add some emotion, to add some color, to focus on the eyes and get the emotional expression in the eyes, that message delivered across. But now it's changed focus and it's being used for professional communication purposes too. Number 6 is about the ethics and the honesty in professional communication. You probably know that. I don't need to tell you this, but in entertainment magazines, in the entertainment industry, 100% of the images that you see in the magazines are manipulated. right? Like in this image, right? So something, the real life image can be and is often very different from what you see on the cover of the magazines or on the pages of the magazines. And it creates some kind of idealistic, some kind of unrealistic messaging and stereotyping of certain groups of population, let's say women and minorities. And you probably also know about this example. When back in the days during the O.J. Simpson's trial, 2 different magazines used the same image in different ways. One used it as is without changing anything, that was Newsweek, but Time magazine decided for some weird reason it was a good idea to actually darken the image, right? And this is just one example of misrepresentations of minorities and marginalized groups in society. But it's starting to change. We actually see some real changes in that, right? One good example that I like is when one of the designers in Girls Life magazine was so appalled that after another issue of another cover like this, he created his own cover, basically telling us what the Girls Life magazine is supposed to focus on instead of what it does, what kind of message it's sending, focusing on individual achievement instead of appearance and other things that are typical for our current entertainment industry. We see it more and more recently, and hopefully this is the trend that will continue. And this is certainly something that we need to pay attention to everything that we do in our visual communication efforts. And the last one I want to talk about was data visualization. We kind of know what that is, right? Infographics. But what is different now? So this is typical set of infographics that we always use. What has changed in the recent years? What changed is the amount of data that we now have to work with. So instead of just data visualization, we now have to think about big data visualization and what it means. And because of the amount of information we have to work with, it creates a completely different reality, completely different approaches to data visualization. Sometimes we have to visualize information that beyond comprehension, it's hard to imagine what those numbers actually represent, right? When you talk about the size of the universe, for example, it's very hard to comprehend that information unless you find a way to efficiently visualize that somehow. Data visualization is not unique to professional communication. It's widespread. It's being used pretty much in any area, because pretty much any area, any field has to work with digital data these days. It's popular in sciences, in journalism, in communication, you name it, it's probably there in one form or another. And regardless of your specific field of interest or career interest, chances are at some point you will have to work with some data visualization. But the good news is that there are a lot of tools also online and easy to use that you can actually use to actually make these things happen. Okay, those are 7 major trends. Again, we're limited in time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for question and answer. But before we get to that, if all of this scared you, that was not my intention, because most of these things are pretty easy to do when you have just a little bit training in specific things in visual communication. We provide introductory and level classes in visual communication that gives you an idea, and then you have a chance to specialize in the fields that you see as most promising for you. But we're going to do a mini exercise today just to show you how easy it can be to actually create an example of visual communication. So let's say you are my supervisor, every single one of you. And I just finished this presentation that you assigned me to do. I need you to tell me if I did a good work or not, and what can be improved and what kind of suggestions you might have. But instead of just typing or telling me verbally, I want you to record a short video feedback using your smartphone's selfie camera. It should be under 1 minute, very short, very concise. And considering technological difficulties of sharing that, sharing that and sending that to me is optional. So I want you can find me on Facebook or LinkedIn and share your video from your smartphone with me. I would really appreciate it, but you don't have to do that. Okay, let's give it 2 or 3 minutes. Then we'll come back and do a question answer, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so 3 minutes. Okay, so thank you for doing that. You don't have to share it with me, but I would appreciate if you could find me on Facebook or LinkedIn. In a typical like classroom in a face-to-face setting, I would actually pull up some of these and we would look at them together, but this format comes with its own limitations. So if you did that, see how easy that was, but if you did that, you just used one of the most popular tools in organizational visual communication, which is gaining popularity. It's video feedback, right? Internally within the organizations, mostly distributed via internal chat systems like Microsoft Teams that we have at UFV. But that's one of the most popular things that's in visual communication, organizational visual communications that people do these days. And see how easy it was to do, to actually create. Okay, so I want to open the floor. We have 10 more minutes, 9.5, and I want to open the floor for questions and hopefully answers, because a lot of things in the field are still very unclear and we don't have clear answers yet, but I will try to address your questions to the best of my ability. Okay, feel free to reach out to me with any questions about any visual communications related issues, subjects. I will be happy to meet virtually or live and help as much as I can. Other than that, if we don't have any questions, I think we can finalize this session. And thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate it.